There are moments in history when wealth seems limitless, when influence opens every door, and when the most powerful people in the world appear almost untouchable. Then, in a single night, history reminds us that some things cannot be bought. On April 10, 1912, RMS Titanic left Southampton on what many believed would become the greatest voyage of the modern age. More than a luxury liner, she was celebrated as a triumph of engineering, a floating symbol of confidence in human progress, carrying immigrants chasing new lives, seasoned crew members, prominent families, and some of the wealthiest men on earth. Their fortunes had shaped industries, financed railroads, transformed real estate, and influenced politics on both sides of the Atlantic. They were accustomed to controlling outcomes, solving problems with resources that few could even imagine, and living in a world where privilege often meant opportunity. But the Atlantic Ocean has never recognized titles, fortunes, or social status. By the time the voyage was over, something extraordinary had happened. The value of enormous fortunes had been reduced to almost nothing against the cold reality of time, distance, and difficult decisions. Today, when people remember Titanic, they often remember the iceberg, the orchestra, the lifeboats, or the famous phrase that the ship was considered unsinkable. Yet hidden beneath those familiar stories is another question, one that receives far less attention. What happened when some of the richest men in the world suddenly found themselves facing the same uncertainty as everyone else on board? It is tempting to imagine that extraordinary wealth must have offered extraordinary advantages. After all, these were men who could purchase mansions, factories, private railcars, priceless works of art, and influence that stretched across continents. Many had spent their lives believing that careful planning and financial power could overcome almost any obstacle. But there comes a point when the rules that govern ordinary life quietly disappear. In those moments, reputation cannot negotiate with nature, influence cannot slow the passage of time, and even unimaginable wealth cannot create opportunities that no longer exist. That is what makes this story so compelling. It is not simply about money, nor is it merely another retelling of Titanic's final hours. It is an investigation into character, priorities, and the fragile illusion of control. Before the collision, these passengers occupied the highest levels of society. Newspapers followed their business deals, governments valued their opinions, and countless people depended on the decisions they made. They boarded Titanic carrying more than expensive luggage. They carried identities built upon success, achievement, and power. Yet within just a few hours, every assumption about security would be challenged. The question is not who possessed the greatest fortune. The real mystery is what remained valuable after fortune itself lost its meaning. To understand that answer, we must first step back to the world these men came from, a world overflowing with confidence, ambition, and extraordinary privilege, just before history quietly prepared one of its most unforgettable tests. To understand why that night became such a profound test of character, we first have to leave the North Atlantic behind and step into the world these men had built for themselves. The year was 1912, an era historians often describe as the final years of the Gilded Age, when industrial expansion had created fortunes on a scale the world had rarely seen before. Railroads stretched across continents, steel reshaped skylines, banking houses financed governments, and international trade connected cities that had once seemed unimaginably distant. For the wealthiest businessmen, success was measured not only by money but by influence. They sat on corporate boards, advised political leaders, funded museums, universities, libraries, and charitable foundations, while newspapers followed their investments almost as closely as they covered elections. Among the passengers traveling in first class were men whose names carried extraordinary weight in finance, manufacturing, hospitality, and real estate. John Jacob Astor IV had inherited one of America's most famous fortunes while expanding it through investments and innovation. Benjamin Guggenheim belonged to a family whose mining empire reached far beyond the United States. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store and a former member of Congress, represented both commercial success and public service. George Dunton Widener had helped build one of the nation's largest transportation fortunes. These were not celebrities in the modern sense. They were architects of an economy that shaped millions of lives. Yet despite their enormous differences in personality, background, and business interests, they shared something else. They believed deeply in progress. The early 20th century was filled with confidence that technology could overcome almost every obstacle. Electricity illuminated cities, wireless communication crossed oceans, automobiles became increasingly practical, and engineering achievements seemed to grow more ambitious every year. Few projects embodied that optimism more completely than this remarkable ship. Everything about it suggested permanence. Its luxurious interiors rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. Its grand staircase reflected craftsmanship intended to impress even the most experienced travelers. Private suites offered comforts rarely found at sea, reinforcing the idea that the voyage itself was an extension of the privileged world these passengers already knew. Contemporary accounts describe elegant dinners, conversations about investments, political affairs, international markets, and family plans waiting across the Atlantic. There was little reason for anyone on board to imagine that history would remember this crossing differently from dozens of other successful voyages. It is important to separate myth from documented history. There is no reliable evidence that these wealthy passengers believed themselves personally immune to danger simply because of their fortunes. Like others aboard, they trusted the reputation of the vessel, the expertise of its officers, and the confidence surrounding modern shipbuilding. That confidence was shared by much of the public, not only by those in first class. Yet confidence has a curious way of becoming invisible while everything appears to be going according to plan. People rarely recognize the assumptions guiding their decisions until those assumptions are suddenly challenged. As the coastline disappeared beyond the horizon and the great ship settled into the steady rhythm of the Atlantic, life continued almost exactly as expected. Conversations drifted from business to family, from future opportunities to pleasant destinations. No one could see that every comfortable routine, every carefully planned future, and every certainty carried aboard was moving quietly toward a single moment that would ask a question none of them had ever truly needed to answer before: when every advantage disappears, what remains of the person behind the fortune? For the first several days, there was little to suggest that this voyage would become anything more than another successful Atlantic crossing. The ship maintained a steady routine that reflected both confidence and order. Breakfast stretched into long conversations, promenades filled the open decks during the daylight hours, and evenings were marked by formal dinners, music, and quiet discussions that drifted from business opportunities to family plans awaiting them in New York. Contemporary accounts describe an atmosphere that felt remarkably ordinary, especially among those traveling in first class. That sense of normalcy is important because it helps explain what happened later. Human beings rarely prepare emotionally for events that seem impossible. Confidence is often built not on certainty, but on repetition. Thousands of successful voyages had reinforced the belief that modern engineering had fundamentally changed what was possible at sea. Wireless communication connected ships across great distances. Advanced watertight compartments represented a remarkable achievement in naval design. Experienced officers commanded one of the largest passenger liners ever constructed. Taken together, these facts created an environment where confidence seemed entirely reasonable. Yet beneath that confidence, another story was quietly unfolding. During the voyage, several wireless messages reported the presence of sea ice and icebergs along portions of the planned route. These warnings were received, documented, and handled according to procedures of the time, although historians continue to examine exactly how every message was prioritized and communicated. The existence of these reports is well documented. Their interpretation remains more complex. They did not necessarily signal immediate disaster. Ice warnings were not uncommon during North Atlantic crossings in April, and experienced captains had encountered such conditions before. This distinction matters because it separates documented evidence from assumptions made after the tragedy. Late on the evening of April 14th, the atmosphere throughout the ship remained calm. Many passengers had already retired to their cabins after another elegant dinner. Others lingered in lounges or reading rooms, enjoying conversations that seemed no different from those of the previous evenings. Some likely discussed investments, family matters, or plans awaiting them upon arrival. None of those ordinary conversations would ever appear remarkable on their own, yet history often transforms the final moments of routine into something deeply significant simply because no one realizes they are the last moments before everything changes. Then, at approximately 11:40 in the evening, something unexpected interrupted that routine. Survivors later described the sensation not as a violent impact but as a subtle disturbance, a gentle vibration, or a slight scraping that caused many passengers to wonder whether anything important had happened at all. Several continued their conversations. Others looked up briefly before returning to what they had been doing. For many in the luxurious public rooms, there was no immediate reason to assume that the voyage had entered a crisis. That initial misunderstanding became one of the defining features of the night. The greatest danger was not panic. It was uncertainty. Information moved unevenly through the ship, and certainty gave way to questions that no passenger could answer alone. Those who had spent their entire lives making confident decisions suddenly faced a situation where reliable information was scarce. Time was quietly becoming more valuable than anyone realized, and every choice would soon depend not on wealth or influence, but on understanding a reality that was only beginning to reveal itself. As midnight approached, the investigation shifts away from the ship itself and toward the people who now had to make decisions with incomplete information. This is where the historical record becomes especially valuable, because it reveals that the night did not unfold as a single dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolded through hundreds of individual choices, each made with only a partial understanding of the situation. Officers moved across the decks preparing lifeboats while crew members quietly awakened passengers and encouraged them to dress warmly and come outside. At first, many travelers hesitated. The ship still appeared stable. Electric lights remained on. The elegant interiors looked almost exactly as they had only minutes earlier. For someone standing in a richly decorated corridor or relaxing inside a comfortable lounge, there were few visible signs that immediate action was necessary. That calm exterior created one of the greatest challenges of the evening. Convincing people to leave comfort behind without fully explaining the danger was not an easy task. Contemporary testimony suggests that several passengers initially questioned whether entering small lifeboats suspended high above the dark ocean was actually safer than remaining aboard what was still the largest passenger ship in the world. Among the wealthy passengers, reactions varied considerably. Historical records do not support the idea that they all behaved the same way. Some immediately focused on ensuring the safety of their families. Others remained remarkably composed, believing there was still plenty of time. Some followed instructions without hesitation, while others chose to gather personal belongings before leaving their cabins. Those seemingly ordinary decisions would later become significant because every passing minute quietly narrowed the number of available options. John Jacob Astor IV was seen helping his young wife prepare before accompanying her toward a lifeboat. Historical testimony indicates that he requested permission to join her because of her condition, but was informed that women and children would board first. There is no reliable evidence that he attempted to use his wealth or influence to force a different outcome. Benjamin Guggenheim reportedly changed into formal evening clothes after recognizing the seriousness of the situation. According to accounts attributed to his valet, he believed that if the end came, he wished to meet it with dignity. While historians continue to evaluate the precise wording of those recollections, the broader picture remains consistent. Isidor Straus and his wife Ida became part of one of the voyage's most remembered stories. Multiple survivor accounts describe Ida refusing to leave without her husband after he declined to enter a lifeboat while other men remained aboard. Their decision has often been remembered as a symbol of devotion, although every retelling should be viewed alongside the surviving testimony rather than romantic legend alone. What makes these documented moments so compelling is not that they prove extraordinary heroism or extraordinary failure. Instead, they reveal something much more human. Faced with uncertainty, each individual responded according to personal values, relationships, and judgment rather than financial status. Wealth had shaped their lives for decades, but it offered remarkably little guidance when every decision depended upon character instead of resources. As more lifeboats were prepared and the atmosphere gradually shifted from reassurance to urgency, another question quietly emerged from the unfolding evidence. If money, reputation, and influence no longer determined a person's chances, then what invisible forces were now shaping the choices that history would remember for generations? By this point in the night, the balance between confidence and reality had begun to shift in ways that no amount of wealth could reverse. The investigation now reaches its most revealing stage, because this is where assumptions quietly disappear. Throughout their lives, these influential businessmen had operated in a world where preparation, experience, and financial resources often expanded the range of available choices. If an investment failed, another opportunity could be created. If a business faced difficulties, capital could be raised. If travel became complicated, alternative arrangements could be made. Their success had been built upon the belief that problems usually had solutions. Yet the circumstances unfolding around them presented something entirely different. Time itself had become the rarest resource on board, and unlike money, it could not be increased. Historical evidence consistently shows that the opportunities available during the evacuation became narrower with every passing minute. Lifeboats departed one after another, often before passengers fully understood how serious the situation had become. Looking back more than a century later, it is easy to ask why some seats remained empty during the earliest launches. Historians point to several contributing factors, including uncertainty about the extent of the damage, concern that fully loaded boats might strain the lowering equipment, and the simple reality that many passengers still believed the large vessel beneath their feet remained the safer option. Decisions that appear obvious today were anything but obvious in the moment. This perspective matters because it reminds us that history should be examined through the information available at the time rather than through the certainty of hindsight. For the prominent men still aboard, another transformation was taking place. Their identities had long been connected to achievement, ownership, and influence. Newspapers measured them by the companies they controlled, the properties they owned, and the fortunes they accumulated. But none of those accomplishments answered the questions now confronting them. The ocean did not distinguish between industrialists and clerks, between inherited wealth and earned success, or between famous names and anonymous travelers. Every individual now occupied the same uncertain future, defined not by financial statements but by the choices made over the next few hours. That realization may explain why so many survivor accounts focus less on displays of wealth than on displays of character. There are no credible historical records describing fortunes being offered in exchange for places in lifeboats or influence successfully rewriting established procedures during the evacuation. Popular culture has sometimes imagined such scenes, but documented testimony paints a far more restrained picture. Instead, witnesses remembered conversations, expressions, quiet acts of reassurance, and personal decisions that reflected deeply held values rather than economic status. This contrast is one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire event. The men who had spent decades building extraordinary legacies through business now found themselves creating a very different kind of legacy, one measured not in dollars but in conduct. Long after investment portfolios disappeared and corporate empires changed hands, those final choices continued to shape how history remembered them. It raises an unsettling question that extends far beyond one voyage. If everything that society normally uses to measure success can lose its importance within a single night, then perhaps true wealth was never the fortune these men carried aboard at all. Perhaps it was something that only became visible when every other advantage quietly slipped away, leaving nothing except the principles each person chose to live by. As the hours passed, the story became less about survival and more about identity. Long after the business empires these men had built faded into history, people continued asking a different question entirely. Who were they when everything familiar was stripped away? This is where the historical record deserves careful attention, because memory has a tendency to simplify complex individuals into symbols. Some became celebrated as heroes, others were largely forgotten, and a few were surrounded by stories that grew more dramatic with each passing generation. The documented evidence, however, reveals something more nuanced. John Jacob Astor IV had spent much of his life as an inventor, businessman, investor, and writer. He was known not only for the immense Astor fortune but also for his curiosity and willingness to explore new ideas. During the evacuation, survivor testimony consistently places him beside his wife, assisting her as she entered a lifeboat. After she departed, his place in the historical record grows quieter. There are no reliable accounts describing desperate attempts to change his circumstances. Instead, witnesses remembered composure during a moment when uncertainty surrounded everyone. Benjamin Guggenheim has often been associated with one of the night's most enduring quotations, describing a desire to face events with dignity. Historians continue to debate the precise wording because it was preserved through later recollections rather than direct documentation. Even so, multiple accounts agree on the broader impression left behind. His appearance and conduct suggested someone determined to remain calm despite recognizing the seriousness of the situation. Whether every sentence attributed to him was spoken exactly as remembered is less important than understanding why those memories endured. They reflected the qualities that fellow survivors believed they had witnessed. Isidor Straus presents perhaps the clearest example of how personal values became inseparable from historical memory. Numerous independent testimonies describe his refusal to take a place while women remained aboard, followed by Ida Straus choosing not to separate from her husband. Historians distinguish between the documented facts and the emotional details added over time, yet the central account remains supported by multiple contemporary sources. Their story has endured because it represents loyalty expressed through action rather than words. These examples reveal an important pattern. None of the men are primarily remembered for the exact size of their fortunes, the companies they controlled, or the investments that made them famous. Those accomplishments filled newspaper headlines before the voyage, but history eventually shifted its attention elsewhere. It focused instead on decisions made during a handful of extraordinary hours. That transformation challenges one of the most persistent assumptions about success. We often imagine that a person's greatest legacy is created over decades through professional achievement, financial growth, or public recognition. Yet these historical accounts suggest that under exceptional circumstances, character can become more memorable than accomplishment. The investigation therefore reaches beyond one famous voyage. It asks whether reputation is truly built during years of prosperity or whether it is ultimately revealed during moments when prosperity can no longer shape the outcome. More than a century later, historians still study financial records, personal correspondence, survivor testimony, and official inquiries to understand exactly what happened that night. But perhaps the most enduring evidence is not found in ledgers or balance sheets. It is found in the consistent way witnesses remembered the conduct of those around them, reminding us that when circumstances remove every external advantage, people often reveal the values that had been quietly guiding them all along. When the headlines faded and the investigations concluded, another story quietly began to unfold, one that could never be measured in financial statements or newspaper columns. The fortunes these men had spent decades building did not disappear overnight. Their companies continued operating, estates passed to heirs, investments were reorganized, and family businesses adapted to a changing world. Yet something remarkable happened as the years passed. The public gradually stopped asking how much these men had owned and began asking who they had been. History has a curious way of simplifying what once seemed important. At the time, business journals devoted countless pages to acquisitions, market expansion, and industrial growth. Today, few people could accurately describe the balance sheets of these famous passengers or calculate the true value of their estates in modern dollars. Instead, they remember brief moments preserved through survivor testimony, official inquiries, personal letters, and family recollections. John Jacob Astor IV is no longer remembered primarily as one of the wealthiest Americans of his generation. His name now appears alongside discussions of composure, responsibility, and the final hours of an extraordinary voyage. Isidor and Ida Straus have become symbols not because of their ownership of a successful department store, but because generations have remembered the account of a couple who refused to be separated. Benjamin Guggenheim's business achievements remain historically significant, yet public memory often returns to the image of dignity that emerged from the recollections of those who shared the ship with him. This transformation reveals something important about the way historical memory works. It does not preserve every achievement equally. Instead, it filters events through stories that future generations believe express timeless human values. Historians recognize this process and approach it carefully. Memories evolve. Family traditions sometimes add emotional detail. Popular culture occasionally exaggerates or simplifies complex events. That is why responsible historical investigation always returns to contemporary evidence whenever possible, comparing witness testimony with official records and documented correspondence. Even after applying that careful standard, one pattern remains surprisingly consistent. The final reputations of these men were shaped less by their wealth than by the conduct remembered by those around them. Another overlooked consequence emerged within their families. Children, grandchildren, and later generations inherited far more than financial assets. They also inherited stories, expectations, and public attention that continued for decades. Museums preserved personal belongings. Letters became historical documents. Family archives attracted researchers hoping to better understand what had occurred during those final hours. In many ways, the voyage transformed private lives into permanent chapters of public history. That kind of legacy cannot be purchased or negotiated. It develops through the unpredictable relationship between evidence, memory, and time. More than 100 years later, historians still debate individual details, verify newly discovered documents, and revisit eyewitness testimony with fresh analytical methods. Yet despite those continuing discussions, one conclusion grows stronger rather than weaker. The greatest inheritance left behind was not measured in property, stock certificates, or business holdings. It was measured in the example that later generations believed these individuals had set under extraordinary circumstances. Perhaps that is the hidden story most people overlook. Success created their place aboard the ship, but character determined their place in history. Long after their fortunes became statistics buried in financial archives, the choices attributed to them continued traveling across generations, quietly asking every reader the same uncomfortable question. If your achievements were forgotten, and only your actions during your most difficult hours remained, what story would history choose to remember? As historians continue examining this voyage more than a century later, one of the greatest challenges is separating documented history from stories that became larger with time. Few events have inspired as many books, films, documentaries, and personal recollections, and while many of them contain elements of truth, they do not all carry the same historical weight. That is why every serious investigation begins by asking a simple question. What can actually be supported by evidence? The official British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry and the United States Senate investigation remain among the most important contemporary sources. Combined with survivor testimony, crew statements, newspaper interviews conducted shortly after the disaster, private correspondence, and company records, they provide the strongest foundation for understanding what happened. These sources do not answer every question. In fact, they sometimes disagree with one another. Memories changed over time, witnesses observed different parts of the ship, and some events were interpreted differently depending on where a person stood during those final hours. Rather than weakening the historical record, these differences remind us that responsible history is built through comparison instead of certainty. Consider the stories surrounding several prominent first-class passengers. Popular culture has occasionally portrayed wealthy travelers attempting to purchase their way into safety or using their influence to overturn established procedures. Yet historians have found remarkably little reliable evidence supporting those dramatic scenes. The surviving testimony presents a far more restrained picture. Individual personalities varied, decisions differed from person to person, and circumstances changed rapidly, but there is no consistent documentary record showing that enormous fortunes fundamentally altered the evacuation process. Another enduring myth is that everyone aboard fully understood the seriousness of the situation almost immediately after the collision. Contemporary evidence suggests otherwise. Many passengers remained uncertain for a considerable period because the outward appearance of the ship did not immediately communicate the full extent of the danger. This helps explain why some early decisions appear confusing when viewed through modern eyes. Historical context matters. People make decisions based on the information available to them, not on conclusions reached decades later. The same principle applies to many famous quotations associated with the voyage. Several statements attributed to well-known passengers have become deeply embedded in public memory, yet historians continue evaluating whether those exact words were recorded firsthand or reconstructed through later recollections. This does not necessarily mean the stories are false. It simply means the confidence we place in each detail should match the strength of the available evidence. That distinction lies at the heart of every credible historical investigation. Facts, testimony, tradition, and interpretation each have their place, but they should never be treated as identical. After carefully examining official inquiries, survivor accounts, family records, and later scholarship, one conclusion consistently emerges. The historical significance of these wealthy passengers does not rest upon sensational legends. It rests upon the documented choices they made, the observations left by those who witnessed them, and the enduring questions those moments continue to raise. Perhaps that is why this story remains so compelling after more than 100 years. The closer we move toward the original evidence, the less interested we become in dramatic myths and the more interested we become in ordinary human decisions made under extraordinary circumstances. And once those legends are carefully set aside, one final mystery remains. If history remembers these men not because they were the wealthiest of their generation but because of how they were remembered when wealth no longer mattered, then what is the real measure of a life that continues to echo long after every fortune has changed hands? More than 100 years have passed since that remarkable voyage, yet the questions it raises continue to resonate because they reach far beyond a single ship or a single generation. At first glance, this appears to be a story about extraordinary wealth, famous names, and one of history's most studied maritime disasters. But after following the evidence from contemporary investigations, survivor testimony, family records, and historical research, a different picture begins to emerge. The fortunes carried aboard have long since been divided, invested, inherited, and dispersed across generations. Companies changed ownership, buildings were replaced, markets evolved, and entire industries transformed beyond recognition. The financial empires that once seemed permanent became part of history, just as every generation eventually discovers that even its greatest achievements are temporary. Yet something unexpectedly enduring survived. It was not found inside bank vaults or corporate archives. It survived in memory. History did not preserve these individuals because of the exact number of dollars they possessed. Instead, it remembered the decisions they made when the familiar rules of success no longer applied. That distinction may be the most valuable lesson hidden within the historical record. Throughout this investigation, we have deliberately separated documented facts from later tradition, eyewitness testimony from popular legend, and supported evidence from speculation. That careful approach reveals an important truth. We do not know every detail of what every passenger thought during those final hours, and responsible history should never claim certainty where evidence does not exist. Some conversations were never recorded. Some decisions will never be fully understood. Some stories have undoubtedly been reshaped by time. Acknowledging those unknowns does not weaken the story. It strengthens its credibility because honest investigation accepts the limits of available evidence. Even within those limits, however, one conclusion consistently appears. When circumstances reduced every passenger to the same uncertain future, character became more visible than status. The qualities that endured were not measured by financial success but by judgment, responsibility, loyalty, composure, and the choices remembered by those who witnessed them. Perhaps that explains why this voyage continues to captivate historians, writers, and ordinary readers more than a century later. It is not because people are fascinated by wealth alone. It is because they recognize themselves in the questions these events continue to ask. What truly defines success when achievement can no longer protect us? What remains valuable when possessions lose their practical meaning? And what kind of legacy survives after every material accomplishment becomes part of the past? those questions belong to every generation, not only to the passengers who crossed the Atlantic in 1912. In the end, the historical record leaves us with something more meaningful than a simple list of the wealthiest men aboard. It leaves us with a reminder that history rarely remembers people exactly as they saw themselves. Instead, it remembers the values revealed when circumstances tested them beyond anything they had previously imagined. That may be the quiet mystery still waiting beneath this famous story. The greatest fortunes on board eventually became historical footnotes, but the choices made during a handful of unforgettable hours continue to echo across more than a century, reminding us that while wealth can shape a lifetime, it is character that most often shapes how history remembers it.